Working. Can you all hear me? And welcome to this a parallel plenary, which I've never heard of before. But I hope you enjoy it. It's on the politics of the future. I'm Cathy Newman. I'm usually on Channel 4 News. I'm today masquerading as David Dimbleby in a dress for this question time style event. So I'm delighted to be here in Harrogate, which was once named the happiest place in the UK. So I hope we're all feeling very happy about that. I hate to sound a note of doom, however, but that's kind of what I do for a living, I'm afraid. I'm sure I don't need to tell you all that times are really tough for local government. The LGA reckons that town halls face a funding gap of £9.5 billion by 2020. And services for vulnerable people are at real risk. So the questions that we're going to be looking at in this session, and we've got some great questions, I hope, from the floor. What can local government provide? What should it be providing? And what do residents expect? So we've got residents from across the country who are going to be asking national and local politicians a whole smorgasbord of questions on everything from better social care and how it should be funded, devolution, the lack of decent affordable housing, the lack of school places and dwindling leisure facilities. So, poised with the answers are Naz Shah, who managed to see off George Galloway to win Bradford West for Labour, despite everything he threw at her. Some supporters in the audience. It was a pretty tough campaign, but she's come through it with flying colours. She's battled adversity throughout her life, in fact, and before becoming an MP, she worked as a carer, an NHS commissioner, and a director of a regional association supporting local councils. So she's got a wealth of experience to draw on today. Next to her, Dave Hodgson is that rare species, a Liberal Democrat. There's some left in the audience, that's so touching. He's Mayor of Bedford, and he even managed to get elected with an increased majority in May. I'm not quite sure how he managed to do that, but it might have something to do with the fact that despite spending cuts, the council has protected services and cut or frozen council tax for 5 years, so quite an achievement. Next to him, Kate Alsop, who also fought a very closely contested election to become Mansfield's executive mayor on an independent ticket. She used to be a Conservative, but quit over the Iraq War, so a principled politician. She's pledged to scrap councillors' expenses, introduce free parking, and build nearly 400 new homes. And finally, for the Conservatives, Councillor David Simmons, not as advertised, but Margaret Eaton had to get back to some urgent business in Westminster. But Councillor David Simmons is standing in as chairman of the LGA's Children and Young People Board. He's also deputy leader of Hillingdon Council. And he's made it his mission to ensure that every child has access to a good quality school place. So we've got a lot to talk about with that. So I want to get straight on to the questions. Inez Newell, I'd like to invite you to ask your question. If you could wait for the mic to just come your way, that would be great.
With an aging population, why has a method of funding social care remained in the 1970s? What system of funding for the next 5 years and beyond will support the most vulnerable? And how will this equate to a fair evaluation of a cost of care nationwide and support for ageing middle classes?
Great, thank you very much, Inez. Well, David Simmons, I'd like to start with you, really, just to sort of set out the government position. You may have a different view from the government, but perhaps not. So tell us what your answer is to that question.
Sure. Well, as you said in the introduction, I'm not a government spokesman. I'm sure you can put some of the ministers on the spot during the course of the conference. But from a local politician's perspective, Britain's in a bit of a pincer movement at the moment. We've got a rising population of very young children, a bit of a baby boom going on, which is putting huge pressure on school places. And at the same time, we've got a growing population of older people, which means in the middle, a dwindling group of taxpayers who are being asked to meet the costs of looking after both. So the question is, how are we going to tackle that? Now, my view, and I think the government are beginning to listen to this sort of approach, is that at the moment we have too much central control, too much top-down when it comes to working out how we're going to allocate that funding most effectively. We've got a big chunk of money that's tied up in the National Health Service, and huge frustration being expressed by hospitals and by the families in particular of people who are in hospital looking for somewhere to go, that they can't work effectively with the local council that's responsible for looking after those people when they leave hospital. And at the same time, a lot of older people expressing huge frustration that they need to be able to access local services, but they can't do that because the money is tied up in the wrong place. So I think the start of an answer is to look at the way it's done in many other countries, in Europe, in France, Germany, places like that, where we have a much more flexible system with much more local control. So the people who are directly answerable to you, the local voters, not only are responsible for the bit that's adult social care, but are also responsible for making our hospital system, our GPs, and those other community services work together. And that means you can allocate the money that's available much more efficiently, and there's a much bigger debate really to have about whether that total pot of money is sufficient, but I'll leave that aside. We can allocate what's available that much more efficiently, and we can prove that we can do an awful lot more by, for example, much better connections between the way local hospitals operate and the way that care services operate, so that we don't see people stuck in hospital and all the costs associated with that.
Well, you say, it depends what money's available, but I mean, George Osborne's asking for £3 billion extra cuts this year. 230 million of that is from DCLG budget. Just a quick response on that.
Yeah. I think everybody's very conscious of the huge financial challenge that the country has. I think if any of us had spent the period, being political for a moment, between 1997 and 2010, spending 10% more every year than we earned, we would find our household finances in a lot of difficulty. The country faces exactly that same scale of challenge. There is no way, despite the growth in the economy, that we're going to be able to put a lot more money into the system, which would be the easiest solution. And given that that is not available, we need to find a more effective solution through local flexibility and efficiency.
Naz Shah, you can't just spend more money, throw more money at the problem of social care.
No, I think one of the things, I'm not a career politician, I've been a former carer, and what the government does is we use the money to mask what the issues are. And I think what we do is we throw over budgets, here's this budget, here's that budget, but actually what we need to be doing, we don't do preparedness. What we don't do is preparedness for long-term future planning, so not just the next 5 years, but 10 years and 15 years. And I feel that the government is very reactive to issues. So now we have an ageing population. We've known that. We've known our healthcare is getting better despite the cuts. We have people who are living longer because of better medicines. In terms of disabilities as well, because I come from a disability background, what we need to do is we need to have much more centred care, person-centred care. I really feel if we had one holistic package as opposed to people going to different places. A lot of older people have said to me when I was out on the doors, knocking on doors, they've said we are scared of building portfolios of savings, etc., because it gets swallowed up. We can't give it we can't give it to our grandchildren, we can't give it to our children. We need to release more funding because our grandchildren and children are now suffering financially. They don't have the comforts that we had. These are the kind of realities on the ground, and I'm not sure we look at those as what we do is the NHS. If we had one-stop shop for people like home care, for example, and you didn't have to go to a doctor to have different people intervening, it would give you a lot more dignity as an older person within your home. And we need to support people to stay within their homes. We need to support people to have their own quality of lives as they define it, not as we define it, which suits our pocket as the government. That's how I feel.
Dave Hodgson, you had a chance to make some changes in government. You're now out of government as a party.
Yeah, indeed. I think there was a start with a Better Care Fund and trying to get social services and the NHS to work together. And that's a good start, but it's got a long way to go. So the interaction between the social services and hospitals, so as people come out, making sure they've got the right care of hospital, trying to prevent them going into care. There's a huge saving that can be made by trying to prevent some of the older generation going into care, and that can be a massive saving. But we need to have it so the savings in local authorities I can translate to NHS and NHS backwards and forwards. So we're not silo-based. If we get the savings, we're not prepared to save them, to share them with other people. And I think that the same demographics that exist in the health service also exist in older people's care. So we've seen the government, this one and the previous ones, protect the NHS. Social services, the same demographics and should have the same kind of protection. On the health budget, we've just seen the money we were allocated at the beginning of the year for public health cut in year by 7%. I don't think that's a good start. If we continue to see that, it's going to be very difficult with an ageing population and expanding growing population to how we deal with that. We're going to have to look at other technology and different ways to do things, but we've also got to balance that with trying to make sure we get the funding right as well.
Kate, also, you're not fettered by any party loyalty. How urgent do you think a merger of health and social care budgets is?
I think everything that we do to protect the vulnerable has got to be good. In Mansfield, we had a pilot, which was an assist pilot, to get people out of hospital and back in their homes with the support that they need. When people are bed blocked in hospital, it costs a fortune. We've just been successful in getting some funding to carry on, and we estimate that that'll save the National Health Service in Mansfield £1 million a year. Getting people out of hospitals, back in the bed, but they must have the care package that they need to survive, and not just to survive, with dignity. You know, they've come out of hospital, they may be very uncomfortable, and they need some dignity and to be able to be at home safely and getting well again.
And part of the problem with this is that we've had a number of years with no delayed discharges from social services. So with the extra money to actually to encourage councils to have no delayed discharges, of course, we're not being rewarded for the fact we've actually got a social service team in the hospital already, making sure we don't actually bed block. And I think that councils, I think there's 8 in the country that don't have that. We need to make sure that we can share that, but also there isn't sort of a reward. We've already put in the money in there, and those that are getting extra money seem to be getting it after the effect.
Let's move on to our next question. Barbara Ricklands. If you could wait for the mic to get to you, that would be brilliant. It's just over there. Great, brilliant. Go ahead. It's there. It's hovering.
Sorry. Why are government cutting our bus services in rural areas and making older people isolated in their homes? A day community service for a few hours costs £7 with a concessionary bus pass, which needs to be booked in advance.
Well, I'm going to put that first to David Simmons again. Why is the government cutting bus services?
I'd have to really go, I think, off-piste when it comes to speaking from the governing party. I think we've got something a bit wrong when it comes to public transport in the UK. We have amongst the most expensive rail fares, we have amongst the most expensive bus fares, and most other countries that need to develop a public transport system recognise the importance of that, both to the economy and for all sorts of other reasons. So I understand why the government are doing it. I think the answer, in a sense, is the same as that I gave a few moments ago. It's happening because the financial situation that the country faces is meaning that all sorts of different things that we'd like to do are having to be cut.
I thought you were about to say long-term economic plan there, but I said it for you. Go. So, I mean, Kate, you went off-piste when you became an independent. Do you think he's being honest here? Is that, or is there realpolitik kicks in when you're honest?
I'm not going to answer a question of the integrity of a gentleman I've only just met. But what I will say is that bus services are incredibly important. Before I was mayor, I was the regeneration portfolio holder at Mansfield for 12 years, and we've just got in a new bus station, a £12 million bus station. The old bus station was awful and cold. It belonged to the 60s. But as well as elderly people, we've got business parks, and we've got a new business park that's ready to go. It's got all the work's put in. It just needs a few people to come out of recession and invest into it. But you can have business parks. If there's no access to bus services, how do you expect people to get to work? We want to encourage people to use public transport, and if you want to encourage people to use public transport, then it has to be there and it has to be reliable.
Well, Dave Hodgson, I mean, you know, fine words from these two, but how are you going to pay for this? I mean, you struggle with that in government. You like buses as Lib Dem.
We do indeed, and my new bus service only costs £3 million, so there's a saving straight away. But it does cost money. We have managed not to cut the rural bus service, but that's going to become more and more difficult. And you're looking at the service only a few times a day. And I was in one of our major cities, and I was shocked to see on the side of a bus 24 buses an hour on this service. And I was just, I can't imagine sort of one every 3 minutes or something. And even in some of the market town as Bedford is, there's nowhere near that level of service. The bus companies will provide the service as long as the taxpayer subsidises it. And we've had some of the services that we have actually reduced and got a book-all service where it was something like £78 per ride subsidy. It's cheaper to do it other ways like getting a taxi and so forth, and it's going to become more and more difficult as the extra cuts come down the line.
Well, Shah, how high a priority would you place on bus services and what would you cut to fund them?
Well, I can't speak for nationally at the minute because I'm not familiar with that agenda. What I am familiar with is my own constituency area where I've campaigned. We don't have a huge rural area. But what I would say generally, what would be the common sense response for me is what we do is the government is cutting things where it shouldn't be cutting things, and what it does is it puts investment where it doesn't need it. And I'll give you an example of that, which is education for me. And education, what the government does is gives money where the schools are already thriving, where they're already brilliant performing schools, and yet where there's deprivation and the schools aren't performing, they get a smaller slice of the cake. And I can only say that that is exactly the same what the government is doing in this respect. Where it needs to put the money, it cuts it from. And I think we need to have big, bold conversations, and we need to be honest about these conversations. I'm not sure the government does that, and I don't have that confidence in the government to do that.
We'll have a big, bold conversation now. What would you cut to prioritise
Well,
local
you have
transport?
to. If we're looking at older people and people being participating in society as a whole, then we're not engaging with people. If we're isolating people in rural areas, then that's an area we need to look at. If we're not engaging them, they're not part of our fabric of society. And if transport is a big player in that, so we need to revisit that. We need to go back to the drawing board and think, hang on, where is it that we really need the cuts? And I'm afraid, unfortunately, the cuts where they fall on where that we need the money the most, and that's in a lot of areas, not just transport.
Is Joan Whittaker here? Because you've got a question, right at the front, and the mic is already there. Brilliant.
Yeah. I was brought up in a damp terrace house with an outside toilet and no hot water. I know housing conditions have improved, but there's still a lot of houses that are still not fit for purpose. I'd like to know what's being done to ensure that every family has a decent home that they can afford to live in.
Well, let's throw that straight back to you, Shah, because, here's a sort of test, isn't it? Do you prioritise the local bus services or local housing plans?
Well, I was raised in a house where the toilet was outside in my childhood, so I know exactly what it's like and how much I used to be scared of going outside. So I've had that experience. It wasn't that's so long ago. I'm giving away my age now. But what I would say is, for me, my experience of housing recently, apart from my own experiences, I was in London looking for somewhere to live recently whilst I got my new job, and I can honestly tell you, I was shocked at the conditions that people lived in London, and the kind of it took me back to my childhood of poverty, and what we have in a reality is in job poverty at the moment. Even if you are earning money, you're not able to afford to live in decent places. I think the right to buy scheme will impact on that even further. I'm not sure that's the right way to go. I also feel that it does come back to the whole argument. For me, it's pretty common sense. If we're putting money in where we've got affluent areas, where people can afford big houses, where they can afford decent housing, and we're taking it out of inner cities where the deprivation really is, then we've got it wrong.
Well, Dave Hodgson, you're mayor of a very affluent area. House prices are sky high, aren't they?
It has its affluence bits. We also have some areas that are sort of bottom 10% deprivation and some areas of massive overcrowding. But there is a disparity between that in different places. And we also have sort of planning permission for thousands, about 8,000 houses that have been there for some time and are being built slowly and not as quickly as you want. But we also have pressure on the agreements with the developers, which start off as 30% affordable housing, and that's been diminished down as they were told we have to renegotiate those. So that's quite difficult when you want to have 30% affordable, you want to have more, but you actually get it battered down by the developers in going to an affordability test. The only way we can actually do it...
Who's responsible for that?
That's the change in regulations by the former Secretary of State, who said that if it's not affordable, developers come back and renegotiate 106 state agreements.
Well, let's ask you to respond to that.
Well, the housing market is immensely complicated, and there's lots of different things that relate to other things. I think it's hard to divorce it from the long-term future of the economy. I know for councils like mine in the edge of London, we've got thousands and thousands of families on waiting lists who've got almost no prospect of finding a house at all within Hillingdon. And yet we talk to council leaders from other parts of the country who are saying their big challenge is regeneration means demolishing streets of houses which could be refurbished and put back into use because of declining populations. So there's something about the long-term regeneration of the economy, and I think in fairness to the government, they are working on ideas that might help that.
Well, they're
in
also
order to create
working
jobs
on...
in other parts of the country, which would bring people into them. I think, where I grew up in South Wales, where my sister lives today, you could buy a house for literally, a few £1,000s. Not a great house, I've got to say, that would meet modern housing standards. Yet in parts of London, we're seeing councils having to rent properties that would cost £20 million to buy in the private sector in order to meet demand. And that seems to me to be a complete nonsense. And that's why it does require, in my view, a degree of long-term planning. It's not something we can fix. There are things like the Decent Home Standard. There's enforcement action by councils to tackle the worst landlords. There's the way that the planning system treats housing developments and the role that councils play in that. But there's also this issue that we need a longer-term rebalancing of the economy. And if we achieve that, then that will help to raise housing standards.
David,
Can I just butt in on one thing you said there? You were talking about how the government had all these plans to help. There's also right to buy and extending right to buy, which a lot of local authorities say will create huge problems. I mean, the figure I've got here, local authorities only expect to replace half or fewer of the homes that they sell under right to buy.
The quick fix to that would be to make sure that any money that comes from right to buy goes back to the local authority so that they can build replacement council homes. That will be the logical thing to do.
Dave here is looking sceptical.
Let's
let Dave in.
I think as LGA, perhaps we should be asking for right to buy to be extended across the private sector as well, and see what all those big businesses that own thousands and thousands of properties have to say to the government when they're told anybody who lives in your property for 5 years or more, you have to sell it to them at a 60% discount on the market value.
Dave,
Will they be on
We've
side?
just had a really good development with working with the Homes and Community Agency, a social landlord, where a building that was actually originally built in 1480 has been brought back into use after 46 years. So a listed building, 10 different homes there. Once someone's lived in it with the Housing Association under the current proposals for 3 years, they can get a £70,000 discount. The money the Housing Association gets back will not pay for the replacement of those 10 homes. It will be reduced. And it also won't allow the Housing Association to do the repairs that we just talked about in terms of houses to bring back up into use, because it was the best houses that will be bought, not the ones in the poorest conditions.
Kate, you're building nearly 400 new homes. Is it enough?
Indeed we are, but let me tell you what we've done in the past, and I'm really going to have to say, I'm going to have to give you directions to come to Mansfield, because we're doing it. What we did over the last 12 years, we worked with, out of John Prescott's office, where there was money available to demolish older housing. And first of all, we did loads of consultation, what people actually wanted. Then we decanted them from the houses where they were into different areas, knocked down the houses that were, as that lady said, not fit for purpose in these times, and built new homes for them. And there were a few problems along the way, but we managed them. After the homes were built, some of them were owned by the council, and we had council tenants go back in. The people who were decanted out, some came back, some didn't, because it's very much a community where we were with the first one. And I think housing is one of the most important things. Education and housing. You've got to have education. That is the way out of poverty for everybody. And you've got to have a warm and safe environment to live. And I think those are things that you should expect.
Well, we'll come on to education in a minute, but has any party got an ambitious enough plan in terms of building new houses? Because that's the root of it, isn't it?
I think we've all got ambitious plans, and in our documents in our local plan it says that we're going to build 491 houses every year. That is what we want to do, that's our aspiration. We can't do it on our own, indeed we wouldn't try to, but we've got to work with developers, we've got to work with the communities to bring good, decent housing home at an affordable price.
I think for me the issue is about the terminology of quick fix, and the quick fixing is what we've done for too long, and we're not doing long-term future sustainability projects. We're not doing, we made a commitment in our manifesto that we'd build 200,000 new homes. We've got homes which are falling apart. We've got housing associations, the right to buy. I'm fundamentally against, because I think it's like what we've just heard, people will buy those that are good enough to buy. If you're going to go out and buy something, if you offered something good or bad, you'd go for the good because it's your money. So what happens, and we're penalised, and we're taking money out, throwing it at something to give us that quick fix, but actually it's not fixing the issue. The issue is still there. We're just covering it up. So we need to really, and it does come back to economic growth. It does go back, and I'd add to what you've just said in terms of yes, you need good education, and yes, you need good housing, but there's no point in educating our kids if they're not going to have jobs to get into. And if there's not that economic infrastructure in our communities to halt it, otherwise we're going to educate our young people and they're going to swan off across the world to where people do offer them real good prospects and good value and money for not only their conditions of living, but their education, etc. I know lots of teachers who have left here and gone over to the UAE and the United Arab Emirates at the minute, and Dubai and Qatar, because they've got absolutely fantastic packages of education and living standards and everything else.
We're going to come on to schools next, but that 200,000 figure you mentioned for Labour, the number of houses that Labour wants to build, is that a target? Should it be a target? Is that the way really to just go back to, localism hasn't worked on this?
I think it's not just the only target that should be set. I think that's one of the targets that should be set. I think there needs to be a parallel plan, which is looking at the stock we've already got, because a lot of people are saying what we're doing with the stock that we have got, that is that we can use powers as councils, compulsory purchase orders, to actually bring them back up to date. I know in my constituency, in one of my wards, we took over a big property that was falling to bits. It was somebody who had obviously more money, and we bought it and we renovated it and we turned it into student accommodation for the management centre. Our management centre is one of the best, in the country. So why wouldn't we utilise that facility? Why let it rot? So we've got that kind of, it can't just be making new houses. That builds skill set, yes, that sets up generations, etc. But it has to be about what we've already got as well, and bringing that up to date.
Well, Dave, with your LGA hat on, the LGA wants to lift borrowing caps so that councils can invest in building new houses. Do you think there's any hope of the government allowing you to do that, George Osborne?
I'd like to think yes, but it hasn't done it so far, and I think that would be a great asset if councils can decide to do that. And this is all about localism. Why shouldn't councils be allowed to do that? If the residents don't like it, they can always vote for councils not to do it. I know colleagues have actually put that in their manifestos locally, wish to do so. So I think it should be raised and allow people. They don't have to, but they have the option to do that.
David, can you persuade the Chancellor?
I'll do my very best. I don't think it's the case that localism has failed in this regard. I think localism hasn't been tried in this regard, and that's the big problem. My council was looking at building some new council houses, but frankly, we'd be absolutely bonkers to do it in the current circumstances, because if we do, there's no prospect really, with the combination of right to buy and the controls on rents, that we'd make anything like the return that would allow us to make that financially sustainable. That's why we need the opportunity to plan much more long term. I think if local authorities had a direct stake in that, then that would be much, much more successful. The UK is going to have the biggest population in Europe by 2050 on the current statistics, so we're going to need to build an awful lot more houses. The other side of it we've got to look at, many of those people who are currently on those waiting lists, they're living somewhere, they're living in flats, they're living in houses. Many of those are not really fit for those family purposes. So the question is, what can we do about that? Can those homes be extended? Can they be refurbished? Can they be brought up to standard? So the overall quality of the stock, whether it's rented or whether it's properties that people own, meets the kind of expectations that we have of Britain in the 21st century.
Well, we've touched on education. Let's move on to education now. And a question from Binta Beddow, please. Where is Binta Beddow? Can you make yourself known? Here she is.
So where has there been such terrible lack of planning for school places?
Right, terrible lack of planning for school places. Well, let's come to you, David, first on that, because you've had 5 years to plan this.
I guess this is my pet topic. Nowhere has failed yet to provide a school place for every child that they need to provide one for. So in terms of local authorities meeting the duties that they have to meet, which are to make sure that every child has an offer of a school place.
Just might not be the one they want.
May not be the one they want, but that's something which has been met. And actually, when we look at the figures, the proportion of mums and dads who are getting either their top choice of school place or at least one of the top 3 choices that they make has remained pretty high. It's 80 to 90%. But there are parts of the country where we have a big problem with this. So if you look at my part of West London, we are, in Hillingdon, we've met our responsibilities. Next door, I know Harrow are projecting by 2020 that they will have a shortfall whereby 1 in 4 of the children they expect to be coming through the system won't have a school place that they can offer. So how do we deal with that? Well, firstly, it comes back a bit to some longer term planning, some rebalancing of the way that this is done. It's the council that has the statutory duty to provide the school place, but we're not allowed to open new council maintained schools. It has to be a free school or an academy, which means we're relying upon somebody else to make that happen. And already there have been examples where that has simply failed to be delivered on time. And it's not acceptable to say to mums and dads, you bought the school uniform, you've accepted the offer of a school place, but sorry, there's not a classroom for your child to sit in come September. The argument we make very clearly is that councils are responsible for this. We've got an extremely good track record. We should be in control of the whole process in order to make sure that those places are delivered on time and on budget. And the other big factor is, of course, in many parts of the country, the problem is there are too many school places. We've seen many rural areas struggling with the problem of schools where they're less than half full. And that means a huge amount of money is being spent maintaining and running those schools that could be used to provide places in areas where there's great pressure. Free schools are a pretty small part of the
Come
picture,
back to
but
free schools, because
touch
I'll come on to that. But Naz, I want to put that, should councils be able to require academies to expand? Should there be more power to councils on this?
I think for me, I've got 3 children at school and my youngest is only 3 years old and my oldest hasn't got secondary places yet. So we're talking about that. And that's not because the council haven't given her one, it's just because we've had issues with communication. Now, for me, I know that my youngest isn't going to get the school where my middle child is. And I think it's not good enough to say that every child is just getting a school place. I think it goes beyond that. The question is really, it's not just about the school place. For me, my background is equality and justice. And equality means equal opportunities for all. That's what it means. It's not about everybody having the same thing. And at the moment, the system plays out. It's a postcode lottery, like it is with the NHS in some areas, in some instances. Yes, there's a catchment area issue, but people who are, I'm blessed. I can take my child to a good school because I can travel. But there's other people who don't have good schools because they can't travel. The issue is beyond just if we had good schools. And we had good schools in areas where there's deprivation, then you wouldn't have this issue where people were trying to fight for other schools in other areas. And I think that's what's not being tackled. What we're not tackling is actually improving education so we don't have, the preferred choices you would want your local school. Some people don't have a choice in where they live because they can't afford to move into the suburbs and the affluent areas. So what do we do with them schools around there? Them schools then don't attract the best teachers, they don't attract what. So it's a bigger issue for me personally, rather than just saying school places.
I just want to add one thing to that, which is if you're middle class and you know your way around the system, you can set up a free school. But
Absolutely.
if you're not, free schools aren't much help. And I mean, I've got a figure here, only 19% of secondary school places provided by free schools are in areas of highest need.
Yeah, I entirely agree. I mean, it's pretty clear, though, that free schools are...
Sorry, you entirely agree that free schools aren't the answer?
Free schools are a very small part of the overall picture, and they clearly aren't the answer. I mean, when we're talking about a £12 billion cost of producing hundreds of thousands of additional school places, free schools, and I think there's a debate to be had about what they add to the education system, which is a separate question. Free schools are not on their own going to be the answer to that. It requires the national work that's being done by councils. I'd say personal experience, we've opened 3 new schools. Technically, those schools are free schools. They're all built by the council using council money on council land through a contract procured by the council. But the provider that runs them is a free school. But Naz is absolutely right. The issue is making sure every child has the opportunity of a good school place. That doesn't just mean somewhere with a classroom they can go and sit in. It means a good education. And what a good education means is different in different parts of the country, different communities. It reflects local needs and the aptitudes of individual children. Anybody who's a parent, and I'm looking forward to becoming one for the first time.
Isn't that where we're going wrong?
Has got exactly that challenge of trying to find the one that's right for their child.
No.
So isn't that where we're going wrong? Isn't it that if I wanted to choose my youngest school, I'm choosing to go 5 miles out for my oldest 2 because that's a better school. Shouldn't I have the school that's nearest to me as good as the one that I'm going to for 5 miles? That's my argument is, well, actually, if you asked a parent, and I can bet my bottom dollar on this, and if you ask parents, which school would you like? Here's 5 schools. They choose the nearest one because of convenience, or the nearest one to their workplace because of convenience, because nobody wants to travel so many miles to get a good education. It should be there in your community. That's the issue.
Dave?
But David's original point that you made is that council should be in control of the whole process, I think is a key one, because we have to pick up the pieces as free schools, academies, changes of age range. So we've managed to open a new school a year in the last 5 years. We've just got 3,000 new school places by replacing temporary classrooms. Some of those temporary classrooms, when the mothers came to bring their children, they'd actually been taught in the same temporary classroom, so hardly temporary. But then we have things like free schools put in place where there isn't a need, and the government's own report said there wasn't a need, and it will put another school at risk in terms of numbers. And what we have is people transporting their children across town to where the places are. They aren't in the right place because we aren't, as councils, in control of that. Schools can expand if they wish to. They don't have to. We can't force them to. So it's actually no central control or even local control over it. Individual schools can do what they want with a minimum amount of consultation, and that causes problems for local authorities to pick up the pieces.
Kate.
Well, the district council doesn't deal with the schools, but what the district can do, the district council, and what we do, and particularly where we've got areas of growth in housing, is to have agreements with the developer, one of 6 agreements, that the developer gives money to the council that is used for education need. And so although we don't actually run education, we can still influence it, and we can influence it by putting these agreements in place.
And the issue with that always is on those agreements you have to top it up because it's never enough to build the whole school. So we always have to find additional money.
Absolutely, but there is money there, and you can take some money out of the development. Yes, you're not going to completely fund a school out of a development, but it is a contribution.
Let's move on to, kind of hairpin bend really, to devolution, and Andy Peters has a question at the front here.
If the Scottish get their way, a further referendum is scheduled. In view of the fact that Yorkshire has a population of almost 6 million compared to Scotland's estimated 5.3, isn't it time that English counties such as Yorkshire had more devolved powers?
Kate, I'm going to put this one to you first.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. I was very surprised and very upset to hear when we were looking at the Scottish referendum, the amount of bad temper and appalling campaigning that went on, and it will take generations to heal after that vote. The tactics that were used were terrible. People do feel very, very passionately about where they live, and I really do agree with you. I think that, you know, if you're going to take off Scotland and Wales and Cornwall as well, what about poor old England?
Well, actually, I was going to ask you, I mean, you've got devolution happening in big northern cities like Manchester. Are regions like the Midlands going to lose out, do you think?
No, I don't think they are, because what we're looking at is combined authorities, and that really is the only game in town now, which is taking responsibilities from the district council up and from the county council down, putting in this new tier, but that will also be able to go to government and get the funding that it needs to do things for health and well-being, and that's an opportunity. Although they're saying that you've got to have a directly elected mayor. Now, in Mansfield, it's quite a small place, and in our area, our combined authority...
Not big enough for 2 mayors, is it?
Well, would that make us a junior mayor and a senior mayor, or a little mayor and a big mayor?
But the kind of devolution that Manchester's been offered is nowhere near what the Scottish have got. You know, we're talking about Manchester being Devo Max or Devo Manx. You know, it's nowhere near the Scottish devolution. And
it's not bad though, is it? Transport, housing, planning, integrated health and social care.
And there are a whole load of caveats on that as well, in terms of how you're funding it. And
so you want tax-raising powers as well,
and been told how to run it. So I've been told that you have to have a mayor, you have to have a combined authority. There are other ways of running it. If we believe in devolution and letting localities and letting Yorkshire decide how it wants to run Yorkshire, then it should decide how it runs it. And if it wants to have the captain of Yorkshire Cricket Club be the titular head of the thing, then it should be allowed to do so. If it does it democratically.
You should be able to get the powers without having to have the mayors?
Yes, absolutely.
Even though you're like a turkey voting for Christmas?
I campaigned against the Bedford mayor and I now am, but there we go.
I was at a conference recently, and they were talking about the combined authorities, and they said, look, you know, if you really, really, really don't want to have a mayor, that's fine. Don't have one. Government won't talk to you, they won't give you any funding, but you don't have to have one. So arm up the back, I think.
Yeah.
David?
Well, I'm married to a North Yorkshire woman, so I probably feel duty-bound to say I totally agree that Yorkshire should have more power and responsibility. But there's a couple of things we should reflect on. There was a referendum on exactly this question under the last Labour government, and people in the region voted against. They said we don't want a form of regional devolution to take place. here and in other parts of England as well. It's clearly time to re-examine that debate. And I think if we look at some of the models that we see in other countries, they begin to provide some solutions to some of these long-term issues around housing and education. At the moment, what we have, even in the areas that have a high degree of devolution, is not full devolution. You have the debate that's going on at the moment with the Scottish Government that says we are responsible, but we do not have the tax-raising powers and the discretion to make changes. And you have a Westminster Government that's saying, well, you've been given control over these different things, why don't you go and get on with it? And that's not a comfortable situation for either side. So I think we need a model of devolution where it's very clear that those who are raising the taxes are also responsible for the decisions, and whether that operates on a basis of Yorkshire, on a Yorkshire in the Humber region, whether that's Scotland, it should be open to local areas to find the way that works best for them. And we're beginning to have some of those conversations, but I totally agree with Dave. There should not be a requirement that an elected mayor has to be there before that conversation can go forward.
But Dave, the government has given councils important powers over neighbourhood planning, for example, and it's been a very slow take-up. Do you think there might be a lack of appetite?
We've had a fair bit of take-up in Bedford with our parish councils, and there has
but
been...
not elsewhere, necessarily.
Well, yeah,
you might be a bastion of localism.
But there are other areas as well, and if people don't want to take the powers, that's the stuff about devolving localism. If people don't want to do that, they don't have to. And I think that's the thing, it's forcing one model on everybody, and it's actually saying, you know, if Yorkshire wants to have some more powers, what's the vision for Yorkshire, what does Yorkshire want, and a conversation. Well, you know, we are one of the most centralised countries in Western Europe, and it keeps on being, it seems to be more and more centralised. Now,
has Devo Mank, or as it's known, is that a kind of high noon for localism? Is that as good as it gets, and now, you know, enthusiasm's going to wane?
No, I think it's going to get better. I think once we get those powers, and I think devolution is the way forward. It has to be. If we want to connect with our communities, we have to engage with those communities in their terms, in their areas, not from central London. And that's not what it should be about. And if anything, in my campaign, the one thing I've learned is that it's people that we need to be reaching out to, not making decisions for people without understanding people, and you can't understand people until you have conversations, and local people know their issues and where they need. So for things that will be different in Bradford, in my constituency, will be different to Kate's, will be different to Dave's, etc. And I think also for me, I raised this with the Prime Minister in terms of devolution in terms of Bradford, because Bradford used to be the powerhouse of Great Britain, and now we have so much deprivation there. So after so many years, it's a huge concern for me. And we have the youngest population in 2020 in the whole of Europe. So we've got to really, really plan for that. And I'm not convinced that the governments in previous years, and certainly my previous MP, planned for those kind of things. I think it's fantastic, but my concern and what I'd like to see is the transparency in them decisions. So it's not because if we had that northern region, for example, if it was West Yorkshire or further in Yorkshire and Humber, we're in happy capital here in Harrogate. It's very affluent, it's very nice. In comparison, you've got pockets of Rotherham, Bradford, other areas that just do not have that kind of, that kind of conversation. They're not included in them conversations, and that cake needs to be shared equally. I'm sorry, but Bradford West needs its piece, and so does every other deprived area. That's my concern, is the transparency of those people who are in power and in the positions of leadership. That's what I want.
Going to move rapidly on to our final question area, and then I'll open it out very briefly to the floor for any questions on any of the subjects we talked about, or anything else indeed. So let's have our final question from Ella Beavers on voting at 16. Ella, make yourself known. There you are. Great.
Due to the recent rejection of the proposal to allow 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote in the EU referendum, how will your party act as an advocate for young people in order to ensure that they maintain to have a platform in a decision that will inevitably affect their lives, affect their jobs, and affect their future?
Naz, I think I'm right in saying you're easily the youngest person on the panel, so you go ahead first.
I definitely support the voting for 16 and 17-year-olds. I think the EU referendum and not being voting on that, I think that raises my eyebrows in terms of why aren't people allowed to vote. I think young people, we need to, young people are the future of this country, so why not empower them and give them a stake in the solutions and the ownership of the issues, rather than, in their late 20s or once they're 18. I don't agree with that, and I advocate for it. The Labour Party advocate for it, and I'm not. Nobody where I come from says otherwise.
Kate, the grey vote's very powerful. What about student voters?
Well, in Mansfield we have a youth mayor, which is really good. It's about engaging with young people, I think. I started doing school visits. I said I want to visit all the schools at least once a year, just to do an assembly, talk about what the council does, how to get involved, the importance of what we do and how we behave. But you know, it's so hard getting those who are over 18 out to vote. It's I don't know whether they under the 16 plus will come out.
Well, why not give it a go?
Well, I certainly wouldn't be against it, and I think the more we can get young people to engage, the better.
David?
Well, the grand old age of 39, I can't afford not to be optimistic about the future. I think 16, 17-year-olds should be able to vote in the EU referendum. I think
Your party doesn't nationally, though.
That's my opinion. The lesson that we learnt, I think, in the Scottish referendum was pretty clear, that 16, 17-year-olds were able to vote. In fact, they voted pretty similarly to the broader part of the population. Turnout also was pretty good, and there was a very informed discussion and debate about the issues. One of the dangers I think we all have to face, though, is there is a risk of political parties patronising young people by saying, here is a set of young people's issues which young people should be interested in, and they shouldn't be having conversations about the other things which the adults over there should be having conversations about. Young people are just as interested in as diverse a range of things as anybody else. And I know, as a politician, you go canvassing, you talk to people on the doorsteps. Young people come forward and they're interested in defence, they're interested in foreign policy, they're interested in education, in exactly the same way as older voters are interested in exactly those same topics. Having become a councillor when I was 22, I've been immensely lucky. I was given the opportunity to take on responsibility, and I think we should allocate that kind of responsibility, give that kind of responsibility to more young people, and we should do it soon.
Dave?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely should give 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds the vote, and I don't see why it should just be the EU referendum. I think it's been our party policy for many a year. 16, 17-year-olds can pay tax, get married, they can actually join the police cadets, a whole range of things, but they're excluded from actually voting. And that seems wrong to do that. And we do need to engage as politicians with young people, and David's quite right, it's across a whole spectrum of different subjects. And I think we all make ourselves available where we can, look out for places where we can engage with some of the young people, as we do with any other group. But I think that they should be, and I don't understand why we're just talking about votes in the EU referendum. I think it should be votes for all elections.
Well, on that note of agreement, I'm going to now open it up to the floor. And if you've got a question, if you could, the hands shut up here, if you could wait for the mic to just wend its way and say who you are and where you're from. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Tom Beattie. I'm the leader of Corby Borough Council. This discussion is about politics of the future. And politics of the future needs politicians of the future. In your introduction, Cathy, you said that Kate believed in scrapping councillors' allowances. Now, I don't believe anybody comes into local government with the intention of getting rich. If they did, they'd be very quickly disabused of that notion, certainly in my council. So how does she intend, and indeed the other panel members, how would they intend to encourage participation in the politics of the future if they do away with councillors' allowances? On the understanding that councillors' allowances isn't the only reason that people come in.
Yeah, and can I just say to be brief in your answers, because we are running towards end of time.
Absolutely brief. I've not said anything about councillors' allowances. I've spoken about expenses. And in Mansfield you get
can I just point out, fact check, I did say expenses, sorry.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
I got it right.
Yes, you did. It's definitely expenses, not allowances. The allowances stay as they are.
Anyone else want to have a...
And there are enough difficulties if you're actually joining a council in terms of getting time off work, having no reimbursement. And I think those are things we've got to work with with companies to say it is a good thing. There used to be a time when companies would willingly give you time off to become a councillor. They are fewer and fewer now.
It's totally simple. You want a diverse range of people to be able to be councillors. That means they've got to be paid an appropriate rate for the commitment that they're giving.
Naz, are you paid enough as an MP? A
I'd
yes
say
or
if
no,
we need,
please.
You know, I'm in a very privileged position, and I'm very clear about that, to be able to represent my constituents. The pay, it's people, and I agree, the people who go into this kind of, I take it for given that people who are going into politics, who are going into council roles, are there because they want to help their communities, and there isn't, and a lot of that is priceless. You know, picking up the phone and consoling somebody. You know, the fathers that I spoke to, that's priceless stuff. It's not about the finances, but I also agree that we have to encourage people to come into a council and to participate. And they need, you know, we have volunteers who work at the charity that I've chaired. You know, we reimburse their expenses. I think it's only rightful that we do.
Are you taking that pay rise that's in the offing?
I'm not sure it's come through yet, but I haven't even had that discussion.
Interestingly cryptic. Right, another question. We're running out of time. I'm going to ask the panelists to sum up in a minute. There's a question here. Lady in the green top, please. Oh, can we have the lady here, please, first? Thank you. And then we'll come to you.
I'm Jennifer Kelly and I live in the Harrogate area. I would just like to point out the issue with, or shall we say, the theory of affordable housing often isn't such, because the developments, the developers are often told they have to provide a certain amount of affordable housing, and in theory what happens then is the housing associations buy these houses and then they rent them out, but the people who want to buy affordable housing then can't do it. And it isn't affordable anyway.
And the question?
Well, it is just, you know, what does the panel think about that?
Dave?
Yeah, I think there are big problems in terms of affordable housing, having enough to actually, for the number of people that want them, and about how we actually build them. We're having pressure on us because the developers don't want to build as many, so it's a continual problem.
David?
The bottom line is we need a lot more housing. You know, the thing that guides affordability is the available supply. And if we're in a situation where there just is far short of enough to go around, any system you have of allocating the rest, whether that's through council housing, through housing associations, through right to buy, through escalated ownership, all the different schemes, all of those will be unfair to some people. And that's why the big priority needs to be to get building on a much larger scale.
Kate?
And, well, in Mansfield we have several schemes, one of them where you can buy a proportion of your house and rent a proportion of your house. And then as time goes on, you can buy more as and when you can afford it. And that works really well. We have a policy where we provide 20% affordable housing, and that might be on the actual development that's being developed, or it can be a commuted sum that goes to another development to help kickstart or facilitate something else.
Final question, just here.
Hi, my name's Darren Pryor, I'm from Leeds. The mental health we've not talked about in adult social care seems to be the easy target amongst councils lately, where the funding is just getting cut to bare minimum. Yet a lot of people I deal with, there's a legal duty of care from the council to look after them, and that's not happening. How are we going to improve this situation?
Dave, your party did a lot in government on mental health, but are you worried now that...
Yeah, I think we're worried because there are more cuts down the line, and trying to actually defend all the stuff we talked about this afternoon is going to be very difficult. But there is a lot of evidence to say if we can get to help youngsters, I think half the people that have mental health problems have them before they're 14, and if we can actually get that early intervention and early help, then we can actually save the person a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress during their life, and hopefully help keep the illness into check. And we can also save the country money. So we need to actually get that early intervention. It's doing that while we're still having to do the cure and prevention later in life. It's difficult to get that primary money.
David, now that the Lib Dems aren't there holding the Tories to task on mental health, is it going to wither away?
At serious risk of harming his chances, I hope Norman Lamb is the new leader of the Liberal Democrats, because he did some great things on mental health when in government. I mean, the vast majority of what happens around mental health at the moment is in the hands of the NHS, and it's been a Cinderella service for far too long. The change whereby public health responsibility has shifted to councils gives us a great opportunity, because for far too long, money's been tied up often in buildings and in services which are not fit for purposes. And we need far more things like early availability of support for people who are identified. That's the kind of stuff councils traditionally are extremely good at, And when you look around the country at what health and wellbeing boards that are responsible for this are doing, some really great examples of investment in early help for people who are at risk of a mental health condition deteriorating.
Naz?
Let's be honest, it's the easiest thing to ignore, isn't it, mental health, because it's not visible. It's not like a physical disability where you can actually put... I went with, before I was elected, with somebody who had sanctions put on. During my election campaign, I met with young people who were mental health service users who, and I'll give you an example, a chap who had to work 10 hours a week, but that 10 hours a week didn't give him enough what the government would give him, but he had to work and he got sanctions in every area. That's not acceptable as the way I see it. What we need to do is recognise. I think we need to shift the culture of mental health as a disability and actually see it for that, rather than use the, which is what we do really, I think councils do, is not recognise it. It needs taking up the agenda. That's what mental health needs doing in its entirety. And I think from the DWP, the sanctions that are there are absolutely, and my fear is the more sanctions that are coming in for those people who can't be measured. You know, somebody with a mental health issue can tie their shoelaces. Tying your shoelaces shouldn't be a measure of whether you get money at the end of the week. Those are the realities of mental health, and those realities aren't being recognised by this government. They are not being recognised by policymakers, and that's what we need to lobby on. That's the conversations we need to have, and those are difficult conversations which people need to understand.
Right, I just want to ask the panellists to just end by giving me literally in a sentence the biggest challenge for local government in the next year, 2 years, starting with you, David.
Making devolution work in the interest of the economy and all the wider services that we're here to provide.
Kate.
And being grown up enough to have those conversations in a calm and rational way, and to going forward thinking of the communities that we represent.
Dave.
Protecting all those frontline services we've talked about today, with even more cuts coming down the line.
Naz.
Honest conversations. When you tell people reality of what you've got a square peg to fit in a round hole. People generally understand that, and they will work with you. And I'm not sure where we need to be more honest with people so we have meaningful engagement. That's me. Community development is my answer to things.
I'd like to thank all our panellists. I thought it was a fascinating conversation, covered a lot of ground, and thank you too to all the great questions from the audience. Thank you very much.